Welcome everyone to this Stockholm's ESL grand final. We've been talking about the teams ready. On that case, I'd like to invite my minister to the stage.
Madam Speaker, the opening government will recognize this, that many of these undeveloped countries are overthrown by the liberal democracies, because firstly, they themselves are extremely divided in terms of religion or ethnicity before their overthrow, and secondly, that many of these individuals residing in these countries have a lack of knowledge of democracy, that they have not experienced and they do not have themselves an imperative to want to fight for democracy to begin with. Because of these, we think that today's motion allows its individuals to ensure the short-term stability of this country, and more importantly, secondly, we have built a culture and society to educate these people so that they learn about what democracy is, so that they learn to fight for their own self. Our model is extremely simple. We say that different interest groups after the government has been overthrown, including the previous government, has equal power in a power share. This does not include the liberal democracy. It includes ethnic groups within the country, it includes different religious groups within the country, it includes, of course, previous political groups, and they will have equal power, and they'll be inside the parliament debating about policies. We say that the representatives of these groups will be voted by the members of those interest groups themselves. So, for example, when we take a look at Iraq, Sunnis and Shias will have equal representation, and members of that group will vote for their own representatives. And we say it's very clear when we take a look at the case of Iraq. We see what the problem is and why there are so many issues and violence reacting after the government was overthrown. We say many of these issues stem because you impose an immediately democratic system where people do not know what democracy is. More importantly, because they still hold self-interest within themselves. They choose to use this new democracy, and because of them being the majority of their country, to oppress the minority. Therefore, leading to discontent, therefore leading to radicalization and more extreme reaction towards a newly imposed government, therefore it being less stable, and therefore democracy not being possible. Today, government is going to prove these three things. Firstly, why is it principally justified for us to make this? Secondly, why on the short term there is stable stability, and finally on the long term, why it actually educates the individual and allows the country to go into a more democratic culture. So the first thing we say that today's debate is a transition. We cannot naively say that we'll immediately impose a democratic system where everyone gets it. We've already told you the context and maybe the problem is that these individuals do not know how they fight for the best interests. They blindly believe in the religious leaders that they vote into the parliament. Therefore, we think that firstly they aren't fighting for their self-interest. Furthermore, we say that this is justified because to begin with, we say that compared to the past dictatorship they have, compared to the past tyranny they have, it's already a better thing. We say this is a transition to democracy. We say this is better than the past. But even more important, we say that this is better because we compare this to what might happen after that. We see that in many cases, like Iraq, like Sudan, because many of these countries, many of the majority oppresses the minority with democracy. We see at the end of the day, it leads to many internal revolutions. It leads to large-scale violence, and therefore the lack of stability. We say comparing to that, we're willing to sacrifice short-term democracy when we build up the culture of democracy, so that they learn to negotiate and learn to compromise. We think furthermore this is justified, because we see that at the beginning, many of these individuals have extremely divided interests. We say that our best case scenario, which is going to be, is that we'll have an extremely balanced policy coming out, therefore benefiting society because there's compromisation and negotiation. And worst case scenario we see is that there may not be any very good productive policies coming out. But at least we block out extremely biased policies which will lead to internal repression. Before I move on to course.
Did you just say that your model will also include the very same representative of the government that you just forwarded to?
Yes, this is extremely important and this will be extremely interesting. So my second point, why in the short term it is beneficial. Tackling the idea of previous political groups We say that this hugely lowers the incentive for previous political leaders who still holds power within that country to a certain extent to organize some sort of internal problems or organize and create some sort of problems that the new government has deal with. We say it's important because when we give these individuals power, it allows them to say and feel that they still have some sort of power in this place. They know that they won't be immediately oppressed, but also they feel like they still have better control. Their mentality will prevent them from harming the country's future. But furthermore, and more importantly, in the short term, we see the problem in Iraq after the Muslim overthrow was this. The parliament consisted of 60% Shia and 30% Sunni. This means that the Sunnis felt oppressed. Therefore, we see at the end of the day things like ISIS because they feel like their voice will not be heard inside Iraq. We say under our model today, because of equal representation, these individuals are capable of talking and negotiating. Therefore, firstly, we block off all spies and harmful things that makes individuals and minorities feel oppressed. But furthermore, it's important as we see that people are starting to learn this approach. We say that it's important for us to have balanced society so that the society knows what they will be dealing with. But more important, it's because we're preventing any discontent that is happening in society by allowing individuals to have themselves represented in society, regardless of the size of the population. Because we see in many of these cases, this is a problem, and this is why many of these new democracies are being torn up. But finally, in the long-term goal, we told you that we want democracy for these countries. How are we going to do that? First, intra-parliament. We say that inside the parliament, because there are many interest groups, we see that there is a need for lobbying, there is a need for individuals and representatives to communicate and negotiate with each other. We think through these opportunities, it's these opportunities where they learn to compromise, it's where they learn to step back from the original self-interest, to step back from the extremely radical self-interest. We say intra-parliament, it allows political figures and political future, people with political future to learn to negotiate and better the political efforts. More importantly, is on an individual level, we allow them to recognize that there are policies which will be able to benefit everyone, but furthermore, there will also be policies which don't have to be that extreme, but still ensure that the society functions, so that the original extremist idea won't happen in the future. Furthermore, we allow them to learn to vote for self-interest. They still have to learn to vote. We say in our case, they learn to vote for their own representative inside the parliament, and at the end of the day, they will still be able to progress the democracy, even in this way. That's the point. Many of these divided societies don't know how to vote. They don't know how democracy works. We think if we give them democracy in that moment, it tears up the society, it tears up the country. We're willing to slow down democracy, but we'll make sure that that country is stable, so that democracy will function as a result. We're very proud to do this.
Like my representation of my position to overplace the opposition side.
Shalom, Madam Speaker. We're very happy to be here today, especially so many of our friends cannot. We're going to talk about 3 points, Madam Speaker. We're going to first talk about how democracy is an important principle we should always stand up. Secondly, about how doing this and imposing this in this country will create a backlash against liberal democracy and the values of the stand for. And finally, how if democracy is going to work long term, we can't cement ethnic or religious differences and those collective identities that come with it. First, several points to talk about. So, when they say that people don't know how democracy works in these countries, say that might be a good argument for from the get-go introducing how democracy works, right? So you vote as individual for parties you support, and not introduce this sort of shadow, right? We said historically, we come to places like say Japan and Germany after World War II, who had little to no experience of democracy. There, we introduced democracy, it worked pretty fine. So you don't think that's the problem. We also think that that there's a need for transition here, which we should have, occupation perhaps, not just immediately overnight hand things over to institutions do not yet exist. That's fine, not argue anything different on our side. But I think it should be very clear, once we met our end goal, and say now we hand over, now this is the society we want to have, and that should be democracy, and not these sort of weird things that they do. We also like them to give us an example where their models actually worked ever historically, where we created this. We're going to give you an example later on in my speech where it didn't. So Lundgren or Nawal, we think that the idea that people don't fight for themselves, that they only care about these really certain groups, is pretty prejudice against us. I think most people fundamentally care about their own well-being, about these families and so on. And when they create these conditions, they'll be happy about that. But I think it's important to point out that the motion clearly specifies we're imposing these on these countries, right? So we say like if they want this themselves, that might be different. If we're imposing it against the will of at least some people, some powerful people in this society, so clearly people aren't necessarily going to be happy about it. We also think that in democracy, everyone is represented by the mechanism of voting, right? Their model effectively disenfranchises people, especially if you're say a minority within your group, within your religious group, that you'll be represented by people who do not support you, a very different mechanism to affect them, right? And finally, on Rebuttal, we think that like when you introduce some sham democracy, you erode the institutions in the eyes of everyone in that society. If you want to stand up for democracy, we have to open democracy. We say that the second kind of democracy will give you the illusion in that institution, because you'll see that you don't actually have influence as voters. Okay, moving to my subsection. So, we think first of all, democracy is an important principle, right? When we propose government as liberal democracy, it is only legitimate to do so when we are upholding values like democracy, like human rights, the kind of values we want to support in our society, right? And we only do this to change existing power structures in the society. For example, empower one ethnic minority over another ethnic minority, one group over another. With that fundamentally illegitimate, will be seen as illegitimate by people in the society. So we think we should stand for democracy, which is the most important principle in and of itself. Right? We think that this is the only way around the country, no way to keep equally as strong track record, peace and prosperity. So we think that by standing for this own principle, something we should always do, is something that lends legitimacy to the idea of intervening in another country, which is generally something we want to avoid. Generally speaking, we don't think this issue is going as a government willy-nilly, maybe we can do it when we have a good reason, such as using democracy, no reason, such as doing that like empowering one new group over another. But we said even if that didn't hold, government gave us the idea that we want to have democracy long term, in some kind of transitional period. We're going to show you that actually this will make it impossible, or at least severely impede the possible democracy in the long term, right? So my second point is that when we impose power sharing, we look at outsiders dictating rules. And in a way that is deeply hypocritical, right? Because generally speaking, we go around preaching to all the seven countries, they should be more democratic, they should recognize human rights, they should be more like us. But then when we go in, we fight over war, and then we do this. We undermine ourselves, we undermine the legitimacy of the whole thing. And then we undermine the legitimacy in the hearts of the people. It also undermines any local actor that signs on to this. Right? And all that goes along with this will be at risk of being seen as sort of pawns of Western democracies rather than legitimate actors looking out for their own interests. Right? And what is worse is that people antagonize the group that might be in our original ally. In many of these places, we will overthrow one government from one ethnic group, often with support from other groups, for example, Kurds in Iraq, or sort of Tadshiks and other northern ethnic groups in Afghanistan. When we do this, when we say you actually have to share power with the group that we fought against, we think that we will risk crossing them, we will risk making them our enemy, we will lose our local allies, just often vital to long-term success. When we are really supposed to do critical anti-democratic values like this, it damages the idea of liberal democracies in these countries. Especially those wars are often possible. We go in and we do these interventions. We will do things like bomb people. We will have people in these countries who lost their children to bombings and beating. And then we tell them, we didn't do this for any fundamental sound principle like democracy, liberal values. We did this to impose a kind of civic power play that we think is dramatically important. We think we will be fundamentally extremely legitimate. We'll undermine all the things we stand for, and we lose the hearts and minds of great immense damage.
So we intervene in places when there is an absence of human rights protection, not in places where there is an absence of democracy. Why do you think that's the case?
I didn't quite understand what you meant. I think that if there's an absence of human rights, it's something we could obviously criticize and want to do something about. We're saying that the principle of democracy is important, and embedded in this democracy is also recognition of fundamental human rights, active rights, like right of expression, and so on. So thirdly then, I think it's immense division. So when we do this, it makes you get stuck in some kind of plan-based, group-based thinking, where you're Sunni first, or you're Maronite first, or you're Pashtun first, and you're only citizen of your country at best. And you constantly see this embedded. I think there's an enormous effect when the state tells you you're represented by a group, you're part of your group, the group is what matters. This is bad for two reasons. First, everything is sows the seed for future conflict. So, for example, we have the example of Lebanon, right, which is a country that created exactly this kind of power sharing between the Christians and the Muslims in the country. And they worked for a while, they worked peacefully for a while, but eventually it led to another civil war. Because people are constantly stuck in this movement, you're constantly worried about this other that the state is created, that is not you, that does not represent you. And because sooner or later, this will lead to new conflict. That's what we've seen historically, they don't give us an example where it hasn't. But secondly, individual rights require us to use citizens as individuals, right? The basic human rights, the right to your own sexual expression, or your right to self-actualize or whatever, are all built around the notion that the state recognizes you as your own person existing for yourself. I mean, that is the basis of all these kind of individual rights. But you're instead viewed as part of a collective. By necessity represented by virtue of you being born in a certain ethnicity, or belonging to a certain religion. But then you create this intermediator between the state and between you. And that fundamentally makes it very hard to ever enforce the kind of liberal values and the human rights that we eventually want this country to. So because this actually impedes long-term democracy, and also those things fundamental principles that we stand for, we are very proud to stand for position.
The opposition made that speech, now acted by the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the rest
Ladies and gentlemen, the very first question we have to ask ourselves in this debate is this: why exactly do we like democracy? Unlike side opposition, we do not believe that democracy in itself, having everyone having one vote, is an intrinsic value that is essential to every single nation in the world. But the very reason why we believe we like democracy is because democracy is the best, so far, institution that protects our rights, that guarantees that there is a fair society, and the guarantees that government is accountable. But the question we pose to you is this: looking at governments. In a country, in a society where people do not have a culture of deliberation, where people do not have the culture of sharing their interests, where the culture do not have the interest in folks that do not even know what democracy is in the very first place, given that they are not the ones who overthrow the government. It is liberal democracies that overthrow the government in the very first place. Do we get all this stuff by simply giving them one person, one vote? We told you, it's very clear. Say the case of Iraq, that it did not happen. What happened in the case of Iraq is that Shia gained dominance because they have 60% of the country, including the government, and used that systematically oppress the studies. And lots of studies became this illusion, democracy, and that is the very reason why lots of them joined ISIS and went against the democracy, went against the country in itself. Therefore, what we wanted to provide you in the short term is an institution that can actually protect people's rights, that can actually guarantee a fair society, that can actually guarantee accountable government. What Benson told you, ignored largely by some opening opposition. But what we told you so far was more is this: in the long term, what we want is not a tyranny of majority. What we want is a deliberative democracy where you truly learn how to deliberate, where you truly learn how to come up with the best policy. And with this, we need people to learn the culture of sharing. We need people to learn the culture of deliberation. We need people to learn how to check out and discuss and negotiate their interests. And that is best established under the model of power sharing as told to you by Benson, but will further be elaborated under my speech. Ultimately, they ignore that we are talking about a country where interest groups and interests are placing a dominant influence within these contexts. We're talking about a country where people see themselves as Sunnis, where people see themselves as Shias, where people see themselves as Christians, where they do not see arguments essentially as common groups. And that is why their model of democracy doesn't work. So let's look at what they have told us so far. So firstly, they say it's principally justified for us to have democracy, because or else we're going to disenfranchise people. But what they have not told us is this: how do they enfranchise minorities under their summer house? How do they have the 30% of Sunnis in Iran? How do they have the 30% of Christians in Lebanon? This is what they have never told us under their model. It would be very likely that you are the ones who are going to be disenfranchised. We see that a lot of established democracies that do not give one person one single vote, one single share of power. You see, even cases such as Britain, where they give a split more power to Scotland in Parliament, precisely because we recognize that there are certain interest groups that have less power if we give every single person one single vote. And that is why sometimes we have to allow some groups to have more votes in order to ensure that each interest group is enfranchised. Because what you have to understand is this: we do not get automatically enfranchised once you vote. You do not get automatically enfranchised once you have a say in Parliament. You only get enfranchised when you get an influence, when you get a sanction of people power over the policy itself. So what's going to happen on their side of the house is, even if some Sunnis get to enter the Iraqi government, they do not have the power to veto policies. And that's why they have no influence on us, even if they get a seat in the parliament itself. Or on the other side of the house, where each interest group gets some influence to veto policy, to sanction policy, and that is when they are truly enfranchised on the outside of the house, and that's when we see we are worse when they are. They say no, because we want intrinsic value. Does not mean it's intrinsically valuable. They never told us how it's not the case. But let's help them a bit. Let's say that it's valuable because everyone has an equal control over these parliaments. Right? We say it doesn't necessarily be the case because a lot of these people within these countries see themselves as groups. We say it's okay to allow themselves to vote and see themselves as groups in the short term as well. You'll see why that's a problem. But secondly, on the case of backlash, we don't really see how small groups would go for backlash on the outside of the house, where small groups actually hold more power on the outside of the house. But secondly, we say what is going to happen is that dominant groups are probably going to learn how to trade off their interests and negotiate with small groups within the parliament as well, thus having less conflicts on their side of the house. Let me give us this example. Lebanon. We say, yes, we can't see that there are constant conflicts in Lebanon. But let's look at how these conflicts are solved. In 2008, after 18 months of stalemate, the Shia government and the Hezbollah and Islam groups, they resolved the conflict by having a power sharing deal with the Shia government and Hezbollah group. It's precisely power sharing that allows us to resolve these conflicts. We say yes, we agree that even under a power sharing government, there are going to be constant conflicts. But these conflicts are going to be solved by allowing them into the government, allowing them to gain power, and allowing them to say in the government. But isn't that undemocratic? We say that is probably not the case. Closing.
In many of the cases, as well as you identify in Iraq, it's the minority leader of Sunni who has been for decades oppressed the majorities of Shia. And that's exactly where these Muslim liberal democracies go and intervene. How does your model serve the purpose of majorities as well?
We told you, we understand that a lot of these leaders have been very oppressive in the past. But we do also understand that there are lots of supporters under them as well. What is going to like to happen on the outside? And that is what I'm going to tell you right now. We say what's going to happen is that because there are probably more than two groups within these democracies, and therefore to get policies passed, to get their interests satisfied, they have to form coalitions. They have to co-op together. And that is why those oppressive leaders have to learn to work with other interest groups in order to keep themselves relevant. And that is when they have to put down their conflicts, put down what they hate about each other beforehand, and learn to solve conflicts. If they do not learn to solve, if they remain their hardline stance of what always will happen, is that they cannot get any of the policies, any of the interests passed. So their supporters are going to see that as irrelevant. They're going to choose more moderate leaders within their groups, allowing them to go into the parliament, because they are seen as ones that can actually support their interests within the parliament. So what is going to happen on the boards of the house? We believe that these groups are going to prolong for a certain extent of time. But members of these groups are going to choose more and more moderate leaders, precisely because of the power sharing institution that we set up. Only leaders that can prolong under these power sharing institutions are going to be kept relevant and powerful under our system. And there's a good slowly learn how to vote, slowly learn how to choose the leaders, slowly learn the value of deliberation. We do not believe that democracy has intrinsic value unless people can actually fulfill the norms of democracy. It is established under our side, and it is forgone under their side, and that's why I'm extremely proud to propose. Thank you very much.
Deputy Prime Minister's speech, and I have Deputy Opposition Leader to the Opposition side.
Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, those watching here and online, shalom. We are against this policy for several reasons. I'm going to go into an analysis of how this will work and why it won't necessarily work in their favor. We compare, even in the best case of theirs, why it has flaws, both principally and short-term and long-term. I'm also going to talk about the culture of sharing as they talk about and how this is actually damaging to their culture. Before that summer up, we first of all see a lot of mechanistic issues. They're saying they want to give equal rights in parliament for every single thing. I'll go into that in my cultural sharing point, but let's say that there's a country that has a majority, let's say 8% oppressed by two small minorities, ethnic minorities, and 10%. According to their model, those two minorities were given equal power, that is 33% each, and the 80% only given 33%. Even if, in the other case where it's a small majority of 10% oppressed and a big minority of 90%, you're giving them equal power. They say that this will lead to massive issues that you need to deal with. And they go on to say to the European government that this, even if it's not perfect, it's still comparatively better to the regime. But what they want to say is, first of all, it's not principally different since you still deny people their democratic rights. We do, on this side of the house, believe that democracy is important in and of itself. That's why later. But what you're saying is still selling, even if it's slightly comparatively better, it's not comparatively better to the alternative that we stand on this side of the house. You're still selling the idea of power representation is good with regards to security. And then the deputy comes up and knives his prime minister by saying democracy is not necessarily good, not necessarily that important. We believe, first of all, that liberal democracy is important, it is a right of itself. The right to be able to determine your life on major issues as an individual is something that we should not say that it's arbitrary depending on what culture or society you're in. Thank you. But secondly, if these are liberal democracies imposing this, it would be, like, we definitely believe that these liberal democracies would believe that this is a right that this should be true. And if it's not, we believe it's highly hypocritical for liberal democracies to go and say that, oh, we could espouse this idea of democracy that it's an individual right, we would never take away from our own citizens. But when it comes to you citizens that we've just overthrown your government to better your future, we definitely can take away that right. Please engage with that. Also, we believe that when you talk about empowering minorities, we believe that they do get empowered in the same way in all functioning democracies, through the vote. We believe that giving them the vote will then empower these minorities, as well as enshrining certain basic human rights, which were defined within those kinds of institutions. So, what is the issue here? The issue that we believe on the side of the house that we're discussing in this debate is how do we best build a country, right? It's probably torn down or experienced massive internal conflict and genocide. I mean, these are the criteria which a liberal democratic intervention overthrowing the government would be justified, right? We're not standing on this side for any other type of just really going into government change. So what you experience after that, what you have is probably anger, resentment, forced to settle lack of institutions, lack of just habit of going to a job where you're respected, not just judged by your ethnicity. So we believe that this can easily lead to the conflict, that's true. And we can believe that it can easily lead to sequential groups and or triennial conflicts that we've seen historically. Yes, I'll take over.
So under your paradigm, the majority of people will oppress every single minority within the country. That is, in our paradigm, even the worst case scenario, these minorities will work together to gain economic inclusion. Why is that happening?
No, what we're saying is likely to happen under the law is that people will agree to some sort of power sharing deal, and but it won't fix, instead it will cement the underlying causes, right? The reason people are angry in these countries is because they have been oppressed, because the majority has been oppressed. And when you're saying that we're not giving you these rights, you're cementing their anger, you're cementing their resentment. So in this, so what you instead then get is that they'll wait until they get this control in order to get it back. So why does it matter? Because in order to strive forward as a country, we need to have function without these sectarian conflicts. You need to view yourself as a citizen of that country and not as a person belonging to a specific sectarian group. And you need to view others as your equals and not as your enemies. But we believe that doesn't happen under their model, because you need to build that in the furtherance of democratic representation. You need to actually build those institutions. So how do we change it on our side? We believe that by actually going and building these democratic institutions, when you've done the overthrowing of the government, when you've gone in, because then you have the will to change, then you have the possibility to build something new instead of cementing undemocratic institutions. But we believe that this, for example, has been seen in Rwanda when after they went in, they decided to keep a democratic structure, not going to power sharing deal, and instead focus a lot on institutional and basic rights of humans, and instead of focusing on who did what and how and what group to they want. No, thank you. But if it's too far gone, we're fine with partaking in extreme case of hostility and certain groups, we're fine with perhaps doing a partition, allowing them to become two different countries. But what we have on their case, the best case, is that these, like their best case they're trying to sell it, is that people hate each other so much that they can't give democracy right now. But we're going to take that away and have some sort of power sharing. We say, first of all, it's not principally just as you're violating their principle of democracy or self-determination. But secondly, and thus in the short run, it's not helpful because in the short run you're not giving them democracy. In the long run, however, you're also harming them because you're cementing institutions that are inherently undemocratic, but you're also cementing the idea that you are not an individual citizen but part as a group because you view others as part of whatever group they belong to and see yourself in that manner. So we don't think, so we don't think that creates a culture of sharing, as they said, because when you are not self-defined as an individual in society working towards better society as a whole, and instead just thinking of your group, you're not being defined to share with other people you don't feel belong to them. Secondly, if you don't belong to any group, feel like you don't belong to the specific groups represented, they will be excluded at all, and there's no reason for them to share with you under their role. So for these reasons, we take you to stand.
Thank you to the opposition making the speech. Now I have the
Democratic representation is a principle that can be fulfilled in lots of ways possible. We believe that it does not only have to be the form of a puritanical election, a popular election. That's why even in little democratic states, we acknowledge affirmative actions and quotas for specific types of community to enter parliament. We believe that the burden of proof of the opening opposition is to show us why only through popular election you can get the fairest amount of representation possible. We don't think that they answered that. This is actually we believe that they're out of this debate. How are we distinct from the opening debate? We're going to show you how power sharing ensures that democracy is sustainable within these areas through two extensions. Number one, how it develops a sense of attachment for the society to the concept of democracy by garnering grassroots support. We believe that is the first step in ensuring that there is a sustainable democracy. And second of all, we believe that having power sharing allows government to create policies in a realistic manner that generates economic stability, which is one of the urgent present problems with this newly democratized society. A lot of those materials that are clash with the case of opening opposition, but have two major point of rebuttals. This is not get into any of that. So first response is always alternative about creating education towards democracy. Sure, you think that education is a good idea, but they don't really explain how it works and see this flow. Because we believe that nations are currently in disarray and heavily divisive. We believe that there's a general sense of distrust. Education can only work if people believe that that education and all of that socialization comes from your own people, ladies and gentlemen. We believe that when you have popular elections, it creates the sentiment that there's a tyranny of majority, that government doesn't necessarily represent you as a community. And so that's why the education was seen like an imposition of value towards these minorities. This is the same example as vernacular schools. When we want to, like for example, promote education, you adapt to the context of certain tribes to ensure that education does not become a threat towards their identity, ladies and gentlemen. So that's what this idea about standardization of rights coming from the opening opposition is actually a bad thing, because it's very Western-centric and does not take into account the cultural context that surrounds that environment, ladies and gentlemen. We believe that the community should be able to define what kind of democracy that they want. That's why we have limited democracy in Singapore in comparison to a very liberal democracy that exists in the United States and European Union. Second rebuttal is on the harms that they talk about, because all we heard coming from the opening opposition is a technicality issue that these seats are going to be distributed in an unfair manner. Some people get 30%, some people get 20%, and all these kinds of things. We believe you need to take a look at the comparative, because if you have popular elections, there's a huge possibility that some ethnicity would not have any significant representation at all within the democratic structure. We think that is a far more worse alternative under their model, ladies and gentlemen. They never substantiated how popular election would necessarily create that representation. Moving on to my first extension, how we believe that power sharing develops a sense of attachment towards democracy. These states were overthrown because they were oppressive and authoritarian. When they're being toppled down, there's a vacuum of power. We believe that power sharing is the operational model to create a stable government. Because as opening government has clearly pointed out to you, that the community is highly divisive in terms of race, tribes, and factions of religion. Power sharing allows those diversity to exist. Because we believe that having popular elections immediately is going to harm the society in two ways. Number one, when you have popular elections, that means that the majority party or the majority interest group is the one that's going to take power within the parliamentary system, right? In order for them to do that, they're going to be forced to do political campaigns to get as much votes as possible. We think that is partly very problematic because you put them in adversarial position when they're oppositional to each other. And politicians have the incentive to discredit interest groups from one another, ladies and gentlemen, which we believe oftentimes are associated and very close to the identities that they subscribe to. Things like race and things like religion, ladies and gentlemen. We think that's partly problematic because the outcome of a popular election is that there's always going to be a sentiment of a winner and a loser, ladies and gentlemen. We think that's partly problematic because you associate that minority groups would always lose out because they just don't have enough people. We think that is problematic because then communities do not have a sense of belonging towards the structure. They just believe that this is another replacement of the authoritarian regime, but there's a sense of election in some way. We believe that under our model, when you have a diverse representation of people, it allows people to have this sense of belonging that they believe that the government is acting on their behalf and making sure that their interests are being supported. Now, how will the world look like under their model? There are three possible scenarios. No thank you. First is obviously political apathy, because these people cannot relate to the policies the government makes. So what happens to that is that the policies will not be effective because you don't get societal cooperation on the ground. But number two, because if you consistently block them out from the political discourse, this would cause into further revolutions, ladies and gentlemen. The best example for this is Egypt, where there is a general distrust towards the current government, people are revolting, and it becomes vicious cycles when innocent lives are always being spared, are always being casualties. The third outcome is that it empowers extremist rhetoric for people to become anti-democracy. We've seen this happening in the ISIS, when people believe that democracy is not the system for you, so therefore you should subscribe to a very extreme interpretation of that. Before that.
Anyone across the world that includes the context in single life, people need to discuss that as well. How is that better than Europe?
Well, here's the thing, right? We believe that political ideologies would always intersect with your identities, for example. So we believe that representation of political ideologies would always occur because there is a possibility, for example, where you could be a liberal British and also a conservative British at the same time. We don't necessarily see why that's problematic. But second of all, how power sharing allows economic stability. One of the problems that hits newly democratized states is their very volatile economical condition, ladies and gentlemen. And this is the problem that we need to resolve. Firstly, is because that it's mostly impacting the society, its impact are tangible and immediate. We believe that under our model, you allow an equitable distribution of resources fairly, because when you have political campaigns, politicians tend to overpromise, right? We believe that when you have power sharing, you allow this balance of interest to exist within the distribution of that resource. But number two, when you have a government that is democratic and accountable, it's clear where the money is going and all those kinds of stuff, it actually gives you room to receive development aid, for example, from World Bank and IMF, because the biggest criteria for them is to ensure that the money will be directly getting to the society. We believe that under that model, you ensure economic stability, that people can empathize that democracy really does fulfill my welfare and does not oppress me in any other way. For all those reasons, ladies and gentlemen, Indonesia is very proud of us.
Speech now about the opposition members.
This is very interesting and was fine. As WBC Ashko would have told you that in a particular debate there might be at least two or three. As the case in a post-conflict situation where there might be 2 or 3 legitimate decisions that might go into cabinet. At that point, what you require is not opinions coming all over the place, but you need